It is an honor to introduce Elizabeth May, an author, lawyer, grandma, environmental activist. She is a true example of altruism in action, a trailblazer for supporting the underprivileged, women, animal rights, establishing national parks, the Haida Gwaii, that's a 4-hour drive and a 6-hour ferry trip that the drummers came from yesterday, standing up for pipelines, starting the Sierra Club of Canada, and environmental justice. She's the current leader of the Green Party of Canada. She is the voice of reason. Mediating, I almost put my notes meditating, and encouraging politicians to understand all sides of problems to work on solutions. She's the recipient of the Order of Canada in 2005, and one of the most prestigious awards, I could have spent 10 minutes just talking about awards, was the Parliamentarian of the Year, and that's where she's, and for many years, the Parliament, members of Parliament vote her as the representative. She dreams big, and the best thing, she follows up. A spiritual person who puts her heart and soul into everything to make the world a better place. Please welcome the love of Canada, Elizabeth May.
Thank you, Andrie. And what an honor to stand before the Theosophical Society on its 150th year, this extraordinary Congress, with your focus on insight and wholeness. So it is indeed an honor to be here. Before I say another word, of course, I want to acknowledge that we are here on the territory. I know you've heard this. I just heard from Andrie that friends from the Haida Nation were here. So in Haida, I'm going to say Hawa. But we're on the territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Wautuths, and Squamish peoples who have been protecting this territory since time immemorial. In my own riding, using the British term for the Elections Act in Canada now calls them electoral districts. But my own electoral district is an extraordinary thing. I live in the Wasanich Nation territories, where the traditional welcome is in a language called Senchofan, which is Haishka Siyam, and hands held up like this. One of the chiefs told me her grandfather had told her, and this was to standing in the posture of a tree. Say Haishka Siyam. But one of the things that I found, I lived there for a long time and only recently discovered, it's a wonderful story about indigenous wisdom running up against Western science, that someone from an airplane noticed that looking down on Salt Spring Island, there was a ridge of rock that ran roughly parallel to the shoreline of one of the small islands, and they thought, my goodness, that's interesting. I wonder what geological activity, what upswelling of the earth would have created that upswelling of rock just running kind of parallel to the shoreline. I wonder how that happened. And so they took a photo from the air, and they took it, of course, to where the experts would be in the Department of Geology at University of Victoria. And the geologists looked at it, and they also said, well, that's very unusual. I wonder what could have caused that. And they were pondering this, I don't know for how many, I think it was actually years, Andrie, and then one of the students who was Indigenous said, ask an elder. Ask an elder. It turns out there was so much people had started several thousand years ago, before the pyramids were built, creating clam gardens, and that along the shoreline, by moderating how much tide got in and out, how much it flooded the area, they could improve the harvest of clams by creating these clam gardens. Up in Waiahanas, in Haida territory, they actually have octopus gardens. And I don't even think the Beatles knew that when they wrote this about the octopus's garden, the shape. But for me as a settler culture Canadian, to suddenly discover that in the territories that I represent, Parliament, the district is called Saanich Gulf Islands, that we have this human-built structure that predates the pyramids, and that when we stumble upon it, looking down from an airplane, our first thought is to go to the Department of Geology and try to figure it out. So it's good advice in Canada, wherever you are, ask an elder. You might find out what the story is. I'm quite humbled and overwhelmed to be invited to the Theosophical Society and to a big congress like this with people from so many countries. Because as you know from what's in your program, I'm hardly your normal, type speaker. I'm describing your program as a lawyer. Yeah, that's true. I loved practicing law, and I'm also described as somebody who's a member of parliament, and now you've heard from Andrie, I'm leader of the Green Party of Canada. So I'm in a disreputable disreputable career called politics. I don't know which race lower, used car salesman, paparazzi, or politicians. And depending on what country you're in, most of them should be in jail. So, moving along. What I wanted to share with you were some observations that are essentially in answer to the question, how does this Congress, how does the movement, potentially, the Theosophical movement across so many countries, how do you shape the future? How do we collectively, who are attuned to something that's bigger than ourselves, that's outside ourselves, that some might call faith or religion or at least spiritual practice? I'll situate myself for you on that spectrum. I'm practicing for you. If you're from the United States, you call me an Episcopalian. If you're Canadian, I'm an Anglican. But I basically, not anything particular. I like to have a home base that isn't about money.
Amen.
One of my favorite American economists is David Korten, and I was at a conference with him once where he said, we talked about communism or socialism or capitalism, but we're not in a contest of isms anymore. Right now, we're in a fight between life and money.
Here, here.
And ever since then, I thought that summarizes where I see that we are. I mean, I come from an ecological background. I was, for many years, executive director of an environmental group here that Andrie mentioned, Sierra Club of Canada. And I didn't want to go into politics. I didn't even join a political party until I was over 50. But I had a lot of involvement in trying to influence politicians to try to do the right thing. I was blessed by happenstance and coincidence to be part of the Canadian negotiations. I was negotiating on behalf of the government of Canada for a treaty that actually worked and is worth celebrating, because sometimes people feel you can't get anything accomplished. But in 1987, we achieved what was called the Montreal Protocol. It still exists, and it actually saved the ozone layer. It actually worked. It stopped the destruction of the ozone layer. We banned the chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer. When they were first discovered, of course, as is always the case with scientific discoveries where there's profit involved, they were a miracle chemical. Wonderful. Can you imagine chlorofluorocarbons? They don't break down at all. They're completely benign. They're so safe you could use them to deliver to the most sensitive tissue of the lungs medication to help you with asthma. Wonderful drug. Wonderful chemical. And it turned out that they were so benign and so safe that they didn't cause any trouble at all until they floated all the way up to the stratosphere. And then when they started interacting at the stratospheric level, the ultraviolet there was strong enough to break them down. And then the chlorine molecule got loose of the chlorofluorocarbon, and they operated to sort of like these days you can refer to a video game as really old, but the Pac-Man thing, right? If you can visualize it in your head, start gobble, gobble, gobble. One molecule of chlorine could gobble through 80,000 molecules of the protective layer of the ozone layer. So the fact of that is worth holding on to, because what I'm also going to talk about is pretty bleak. The fact that not only did it work, that countries around the world decided to ban the use and production of chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer. Even when, I can tell you, the US White House at that time, it was Ronald Reagan, And his Secretary of the Interior was a guy named Don Hodel. And as we started the negotiations in Montreal in 1987, Don Hodel tried to undercut the head of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, who was a fine human being. And he said, we don't need to ban these chemicals. We just need broad brimmed hats and sunscreen. And you try to find out someone like Don Hodel that you're not going to have any agriculture if you don't have an ozone layer, because the UV radiation won't just give us all skin cancer. Well, mostly the light-skinned people. But what about crops? So anyway, we managed to get this agreement across the finish line, and it was one of those things that I think of as miraculous. One of the things I take from my faith is a literal belief in miracles, which is one of the only reasons I can be leader of the Green Party of Canada and remain hopeful. I'm the only member requirement for our party right now, for those other countries, but I would have come back to the Green movement because it does, I'm not going to be partisan at all, I promise, but in terms of the kind of world we're in right now, it's occurred to me for a very long time that everything about politics, and for that matter, everything about capitalism and an economic growth model, is about the opposite of wholeness. Everything about the economic model is to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. So the consumer model, if you picture it in such ways that where you might used to have had a neighborhood where everybody went to the same laundromat to do their laundry. So it's a community thing. Everybody didn't have to own their own thing. And to increase consumption, it was much better to break down a neighborhood into individual households where everyone would have to have their own washer dryer. So less community, more private property, more buying things. And then once the consumer model, and of course this took off post-war with a huge boom, right? So then you have to break down households. So there's individual markets within every household. If you can, for instance, the ultimate of it is to convince children that they want their own consumer thing, and they can bug their parents till they get it. And ideally, if you can break down the family dinner so no one ever sits down together for dinner, then you've got the teenagers want to have the certain frozen thing that they grab out of the freezer and put in the microwave and run out the door with a pizza pop, while the parents go to separate places. And every unit is busy buying things, because the big lie of consumerism is if we only had more, we'd be happy. So it's the kind of lie that's diabolical, and I mean that in its literal meaning of, well, devil's pretty clever. It's diabolical because you can always get more stuff. And if you're not happy yet, you don't stop and think to yourself, I don't think having more stuff is making me happy. I think maybe I should find some other way to be happy. But happiness is, I think, a universal human goal. But buying stuff, if it's not making you happy, you can merely reflect on the lie, which says you don't have enough yet. Look at Jeff Bezos and his wedding in Venice. They looked happy. Never mind. So you could be a billionaire and still think you don't have enough because there's trillionaires. More all the time, more. And breaking down and dividing. And then in a world facing, and I will talk about this more, polycrisis. When we're facing a polycrisis across multiple planes, and you're feeling, as people start paying attention, and that does happen, even in a consumer society where the overwhelming message is individualism, instant gratification, selfishness as being the and this is, of course, not universal through all the countries that are in this room, but it's certainly the North American culture is very much based on selfish individualism. If you start actually paying attention and saying, well, wait a minute, we're in an extinction crisis. Species are going extinct all over the place. And wait a minute, there's a climate crisis. And wait a minute, there's also seems to be a geopolitical undoing here. Putin invaded Ukraine. That wasn't supposed to happen. Remember,
but we were supposed to have the end of history, and ground wars in Europe weren't something we thought would ever happen again. And genocide, so if you start paying attention to things, it's easy to be overwhelmed by a sense of despair. And one of the things that anesthetizes people against despair is addiction. So we're addicted to many things in a consumeristic culture. We're addicted to these things. We're addicted to screen time and what now is called doom scrolling. You can get addicted to those things. That's another part of breaking down the family unit, is the addiction and the invasion of a child's space by what they see on screen. And a friend of mine who's a professor of English at UVic, University of Victoria, told me she was worried about the young women in her classes. She said if they're not Instagrammable, they feel that they have no social capital and they don't have friends. And if they're not able to constantly photograph themselves looking beautiful and posting it, they fall into a place where they don't know their own value or worth, and they don't have friends. The same professor told me that 10 years ago, when she'd say to a classroom, "We're on a half-hour break, I'll be back," she used to come back to the classroom, and the students would have broken out to sit with friends, and they'd be kind of buzzing. They'd be talking to each other. And she said now when she leaves the classroom and she comes back, they're all looking at their screens and no one's talking to anybody else. So addictions are a real problem in our society, and yes, addictions to opioids are a crisis. But addictions can take all kinds of shapes and forms, and our addictions are distractions. So in terms of, again, coming back to the word wholeness, and where does this come into a society like that? I don't know how many of you have heard of the great Hungarian-Canadian Gabor Mate, who writes a lot about mental wellness and mental health and addiction. And I think it's profound and crosses many issues beyond, well, mental health and wellness is a big issue. But he said the opposite of addiction is connection. And as I was describing about the consumeristic capitalist model for consumption and driving consumption, consumption benefits from alienation and a lack of connection. The more connected we are, the more we are associated in communities, and the more we are able to say, there's something more in my life than my paycheck or the fact I don't have enough money. Addiction's opposite is connection. Now, that suggests that if we want to have a society where we can embrace wholeness, we have to question the overwhelming economic model that tells us that the country is successful if the GDP is growing, which of course the GDP, the gross domestic product, or gross national, the GNI, are all measures of things that are meaningless. So if you have a big plane crash, this has been said for decades, obviously, if you have a major disaster and a lot of people are employed picking up the body parts and racing off to get the coffins, it registers positive to the GDP. It's a meaningless measurement, but most countries use it as their measure of success. In all of this, where's the place for anyone to think about anything to do with the value and the meaning of life itself and why we're here to ask big questions? And that's where one part of my life, the political part of my life, overlaid with something that I think was extraordinary, and that's what I'm going to read from it. I'm hoping you've heard of it. It's called the Earth Charter. And it's the one thing that I ever worked on, and it was in 1997 that we completed it. I was a member of the Earth Charter Commission. So I wasn't yet in politics. I hadn't even joined a party, but never mind, I was working at Sierra Club. I was influencing politicians. I was working in a political kind of world. But this was put together in the aftermath of the Rio Earth Summit. I worked a lot on the Rio Earth Summit, which happened in 1992. But the Earth Charter had been one of the things that the organizers of the United Nations Conference on Environment Development, which was called the Rio Earth Summit, one of the documents we'd hoped to have ready for acceptance by what was then, at that point, the largest single gathering of heads of government in the history of the world. I was there then. My daughter's now 34. She hadn't yet turned 1, and I was holding her as this happened, as I watched and listened to the speeches of everyone from George Bush, the senior George Bush. You know, you never think in hindsight, you'd look back at someone like George Bush and say, what a statesman, but never mind. George Bush, Americans are laughing. Now I can identify geographically, right? So George Bush, everyone from George Bush to, at that point, Canada's Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, to Fidel Castro, all of us, everybody was there, all committing to a series of conventions. One is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which we're still operating with the conferences of the parties on climate change. The Paris Agreement came out through that treaty. And the Convention on Biodiversity to protect all life on Earth and protect species from extinction and ecosystems from disappearance. And the Earth Charter just didn't make it across the finish line. There was one negotiation moment that I recall where the Canadian ambassador for the environment which is a position that doesn't exist anymore, but the Canadian ambassador for the environment was an old law school friend of Brian Mulroney's. And, in politics, people say, well, all that cronyism. But my God, Brian Mulroney's old school chum, Arthur Campo, was a hell of a guy and lovely, and he was our ambassador for environment. And he said at one moment in the negotiations, we should think of the Earth Charter as the kind of document that a kid could hang on their bedroom wall. And one of the delegates from the Global South said, our children don't have bedrooms, which was the truth. But it kind of brought things to a bit of a stop. And it didn't find its feet again. The World Society of Quakers, the Friends meetings around the world, were very engaged with this. There was a significant element of Buddhism working on the active Buddhist community was working with the Quakers, and there was a lot of input from various strands of faith-based communities, but it was also political, and there was a lot of work that went into the Earth Charter, but it fell off the rails, and it didn't get approved. There was no document to approve when we were at the Rio Earth Summit in June '92. So when it didn't get across the finish line, two people decided they should keep trying. One was the Secretary General of the UNCED Earth Summit at Rio, who was a Canadian, Maurice Strong. And the other was a name you'll know, I think, globally as well, Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev, having left power, having brought about the kind of transition I'll talk about later of, the kind of well-fortified centralization of power and total control that was the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev with glasnost and perestroika brought about the end of that, and unfortunately was let down by the world. It should have led to more changes to make the people of Russia better off, the former Soviet Union better off, but it didn't. Anyway, Mikhail Gorbachev turned his attention to forming something called Green Cross, so we could focus on the environment a lot more. So Mikhail Gorbachev and Maurice Strong got together with a number of other people who'd been part of the Earth Summit process, and they formed the Earth Charter Commission, and it was made up of people like the former heads of government, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Ruud Lubbers, the former president of Mali, but then some environmentalists, so I ended up being appointed to it, as well as there were indigenous peoples, faith leaders, people from around the world, and we worked until, and we had public sessions. I didn't go to this one, but since so many of you are here for India, the one in India had thousands of people attend to contribute to drafting a new version of the Earth Charter. So in 1997, at Rio +5, we got together again. By now, my daughter's much older, and she sat with Raisa Gorbachev and drew her little pictures because Raisa Gorbachev didn't have a translator with her, and the whole thing was really boring. And so my daughter and Raisa Gorbachev hung out. But the Earth Charter document that we signed off on then has now been supported by some UN agencies, some governments. And it's worth mentioning because it's the one place where you find some of the notions of there's something going on here and it's more than money, and it's really important. So I thought I'd read from, at least from part of the preamble, and you might find it somewhere, online, the Earth Charter. By the way, if any of you are cosmologists and remember Brian Swim, the Earth is a Green Dragon, he was one of our advisors. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. As the world becomes increasingly interdependent and fragile, the future at once holds great peril and great promise. To move forward, we must recognize that in the midst of a magnificent diversity of cultures and life forms, we are one human family and one Earth community with a common destiny. We must join together to bring forth a sustainable global society founded on respect for nature, universal human rights, economic justice, and a culture of peace. Towards this end, it is imperative that we, the peoples of the earth, declare our responsibility to one another and to the greater community of life and to future generations. It works through over several pages, developing a number of principles. One thing that I just wanted to read aloud because it came from the Earth Charter Commissioner from India, Kamla Chowdhury, and she was part of a Gandhian center in India, and she'd worked with Mahatma Gandhi, but she added for us this thought that when basic needs have been met, human development is primarily about being more, not having more. Amen. So again, in relation to this notion that we just have to have more stuff, and then we'll be a success. Have more stuff, and then we'll be happy. Have homes that have more square footage than anyone could possibly use, but that's all right. Being more is a far more insightful goal for a life's mission than having more, and yet our society tells us all the time that all that really matters is having more. And certainly the economic models of exploitation, colonialism are brutal, exploitative, and unfair. And this is the only document I know of that crosses that line between governments saying we support the Earth Charter, which Mexico has done and Costa Rica has done and the Netherlands has done. Individual cities, Victoria, British Columbia, has endorsed the Earth Charter, but it remains unfulfilled as a promise because so much work went into really crafting something. I mean, when we started talking about women's rights, and a Muslim member of our committee was King Hussein's sister, Princess Basma of Jordan. She was so fantastic because she was a really strong feminist, but she was able to say, if we put it this way, we won't offend anyone in my culture. We must put it this way. It was a precise and diplomatic process to come up with a document this good. Similarly, another document that I think everyone should read, regardless of faith tradition, was Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si', where if you haven't read it, it really isn't just for Catholics at all, or it isn't even for Christians. It also points out that our culture of consumerism is one of instant gratification and selfishness that ultimately it leads to despair, unhappiness, and alienation. And that a throwaway society, whether you think you can throw out something that you think of as garbage that's going to end up in some landfill somewhere, once you have a throwaway culture, you also have throwaway human relationships, throwaway life experience. Just there is no away, and things that matter are things you have to think about. We now have a new term out there called the attention economy, because there's so much information. There's no shortage of information, but what's scarce is attention. And there certainly are enough political narcissists we don't need to name them, where what they're seeking is attention all the time. Attention, 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 which is also back to the distraction and the addiction of immediate gratification because you click something. How many likes do you get? You retweet something. Well, when we come down to it, and this is where I come down to where I want to ask for your help, it would be very easy looking at the science on the climate crisis or the science on loss of species around the world to see the world right now, and of course, as I mentioned, the polycrisis lens. One of my favorite people in politics anywhere around the world is the Prime Minister of Barbados, is Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And she speaks of, in a polycrisis world, it's a term we don't always think of, but everywhere you look, the established orders, just as I mentioned how the Kremlin collapsed, the last people to notice the Kremlin was collapsing were the people inside. Capitalism will collapse, and the last people to notice will be the people on Wall Street. The people who are figuring out, how do I hedge my bets, buy low, sell high, where's my opportunity here to make even more money? They won't notice till it's happened. So in a polycrisis world, we're hitting levels of disequilibrium across multiple planes. I'll say if you want to read more deeply into this, because I'm not doing it justice, but Professor Thomas Homer Dixon, who runs something at University of Royal Roads on Vancouver Island called the Cascade Institute, looks at polycrisis and writes about it. So I tend to think of it as trying to visualize for myself this kind of a Rubik's Cube of multiple planes. You know how Rubik's Cubes work, and they all fit. If everything goes wobbly all at once, it could be a disaster, or it could be, which is what I hope you'll agree is possible, it could be an enormous opportunity. Everything's gone wobbly all at once. The old orders are breaking apart. Some of them deliberately through the recklessness, and goodness knows if Donald Trump has any plan at all for anything. But there certainly is the case, Putin. How is it that Netanyahu's getting away with genocide? What's happening? It's all wobbly all at once across multiple planes. So into that moment, step up the predictable people who've been the masters of the universe for so long they don't notice their day may be done. So they move in and say, it's an emergency. Now in Canada, that's been manifested by the Prime Minister and the premiers of British Columbia, who is, by the way, NDP, and Ontario, who is Conservative, and Nova Scotia, who is Conservative. All of those levels of government have recently passed laws that say it's an emergency, so we can ignore environmental laws and Indigenous rights because we have to be able to build things fast. Within the last couple days, the Congress in Brazil passed the same law. Well, not word for word, but the same intent. We've got to be able to build things fast. We can't be held back by environmental laws. Now, of course, the president of Brazil, Lula, is left-wing, but the Congress of Brazil is primarily right-wing. So they passed this law, and a lot of us globally are trying to stop it. Oh, I said I wasn't going to mention the Green Party except this one thing. The Global Earth Charter, by the way, for those of you who are Greens, the only thing that holds global Green parties together, and we're in more than 80 countries around the world, is we distilled the Earth Charter to 6 global green values. So our values as a political party are derived from the Earth Charter. So when we see this happening, I only know about what just happened in Brazil because I was on a conference call with the Brazilian Green Party people the morning it happened. I haven't seen it in any newspapers in Canada, but they're reeling from it, and we're putting out a statement with them to say to President Lula, please veto this bill. The Amazon is too important to allow Bolsonaro's buddies in your Congress to decide it's more important to get through pipelines and roads and whatever, mining, than protect the Amazon. So we're hoping that Lula will veto this bill. So in a crisis, polycrisis, everything's gone wobbly, predictably, the bullies will show up. So they've had the power a long time, and they can step up and say, it's an emergency. And unless people question them and say, how does what you're proposing have anything to do with the emergency? Thoughtful people asking questions will make a big difference, but so far, for the most part, other than the Indigenous people of Canada who are standing up, we're seeing a lot of people saying, well, it's an emergency. And the emergency doesn't have to be explained. You just say, Trump? But yeah, he's threatening us with tariffs. What makes us think that's a good time for us to destroy the nature here? How does that connect? Give me at least a plausible narrative that connects these things. So when they say it's an emergency, some of you may have read already, but pull it out if you haven't, Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine. As soon as it's an emergency, what more can you push through? More on that agenda of the fascists, the dictators, and the transnational corporations. I basically think of the fossil fuel industry as a form of organized crime that's global. So that's where we could, for instance, all of us, okay, so at a time when things are all going wobbly across multiple planes, that's an opportunity because they're experiencing disequilibrium. They could be on the point of collapse and not know it. So what pushes the world order to what we need, which is respect for all life? What allows us to imagine for 1 minute that the quest for money and power could be replaced by love? How could we do that? It has to start in multiple countries. It has to start here and here. It starts with, depending where you're coming from, meditation or prayer, sending out to all the ways in which we know fundamentally we are all connected. I'm not going to try to describe the ways we're connected, but I sure know that the life form and love that flows through me flows through you. How do we explain that? I don't know. But if we all start thinking the same way, or at least enough to inject into our own cultures, wherever we are, whatever voice we have, how do we start saying, wait a minute, the bully boys are losing. The tyrant's day is done. This is the time for people. This is our time for my little granddaughter. I was showing pictures over there. Her name is Lily. And her first movement as a little baby was to stretch. And she had this funny stretch with a clenched fist. And I've always said, the babies united will never be defeated. So I don't know if it's much of a movement because it's hard to see how she's going to take it anywhere because she can't talk yet. But if we around the world started thinking, how do we move the culture of our town, our family, our community, our country? How do we start saying, can we not agree here that the root cause of what's causing us pain and grief and suffering, the root cause of the abuse of human rights that we see around the world, the root cause that the wealthiest top 1% have more wealth than the whatever, 60%, 90% of the rest of us? That's not right. Can we not say together from every place around the world where you are, with every community within, where you break bread, this is a moment of opportunity, and we take hold of it, and we say to those who think they deserve to have power, you're over. We're taking this back because this planet, this sacred creation that we were not put in charge of, we are merely here as fellow creatures on the same planet with the First Nations people I mentioned earlier in my community, the Wasanich people. But it's universal across Canada. Almost every Indigenous prayer ends with, and all my relations. And it wasn't until I was living in Wasanich territory where Adam Olson, who's a Sartlip and a friend of a number of us here, he said he was raised to understand his grandmother took him, and his grandmother had taken his father out in a boat to be fishermen. And they went out in the boat, and the grandmother called to the whales and said, these are my sons, they'll be fishing here. And explained to the whales and explained the sons the mutuality. The whales used to help the Indigenous fishermen by driving the salmon they didn't want towards them, and the Indigenous fishermen helped them by not taking their favorite salmon out of the water. So it was a relationship of mutuality, so that in the community where I live, it is literally the case that Indigenous people regard the orcas and the eagles and the salmon, and the literal translation in Senchothan is the whale people, the salmon people, the tree people, all related. So if we can shift our worldview enough to say, these forests aren't resources, these are our relatives. These fish are not resources, they are our relatives. Yes, we're going to eat fish, and yes, we're going to cut down trees, but we're going to do it with a measure of compassion and respect that is the relationship that we're in. The mutuality, relationship, love, those principles have to rise up above greed and economic growth as ends in themselves. We have to redefine and reassert that as humanity, we are one human family, one earth community, and we cannot be divided one against the other. Otherwise, we don't survive. So yes, there is self-interest at the base of it. We want to survive, but we also want to recognize that having more can never replace being more, and that by being together in pursuits of the kinds of things that Theosophical Society does, and all of you in your communities do, in terms of saying, what's the meaning of life? What's truth? What do we seek? How do we live our lives in ways that could be a useful example to others? Well, all those questions I leave you with. But the goal here is to help every single human being to avoid what we see in our culture of throwaway lives where people who are suffering with mental health and addiction issues are just consigned to being thrown away. Or where we think that if there's one really valuable tree, who'll be the first one to get there to cut it down? We have an opportunity right now, because when things are in disequilibrium, nobody's in control. And that's actually really good news. So we can connect, and I really do believe this, we can shift that. So again, in this wobbly Rubik's Cube of my imagination of multiple polycrises, geopolitical polycrisis, economic crisis, biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, equity crisis, right across all these different planes, everything's wobbly. What would be the thing that puts it out there and says, in this moment, everything's changed, and we have justice and fairness, kindness and love, pulling all of our societies together, and everyone can say, isn't it nice to be one human family? Isn't it nice to know that we can breathe, care for each other, and be safe, knowing that there's enough in the world for all if we share? Just as Gandhi said, there's not enough to meet the greed of one village, but there's enough for all when we let go of greed. That's not an exact quote, but you remember what he really said. These things are not on the television news. These things are not talked about in Parliament very much. But there's a deep, deep thirst, because across all these different crises, there is, at least in North American society, because that's where I'm living, there's a deep spiritual crisis, knowing that something isn't right about the fact that the biggest bullies have the most money. And if the measure of success is money, where's the karma in that? No. The bullies' day is done. They are exposed for what they are: empty shells of threats, mean-spiritedness, and greed. And the rest of us, united, can change everything. Hear, hear. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, we got it. Okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you for being you, Elizabeth. You're strong, you're willing to stand up for truth, you inspire, and you give us hope. We are grateful as we know that you have a very busy schedule. Our Congress would keep saying, Andrie, but what about Elizabeth? And I would say, yes, she's incredibly busy right now. And we'd have to wait a month or two.
Yeah.
And then Shakir and Catalina were like, what about security? And I was like, oh, well, in our politics, you have to realize everybody loves Elizabeth. You go out to go on protests with her, and everybody from every denomination, she can barely walk in the protest. They're hugging her, running up to her. She's a person of the people, a people of the person. No. And gratitude to her husband. Her husband studied Buddhism. He loves music. And behind every exceptional person, there's an exceptional person. And his support and love that he gives her is incredible. So our World Congress sends out incredible gratitude because we know time is precious in many levels, and you just give so much love. So on that note, we'd really like to thank you. And we have a bit of time for questions. So if anybody's brave and would like to ask a question, you can ask it, and Elizabeth's brave to answer it.
Well, I think that's the gentleman who said amen a few times. So that would be RuPaul. Can I get an amen up in here? Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. One of the things that many of us in Theosophy are worried about is our dadgum concern about our tax shelter. How do we communicate that moral commitment can exceed our concerns about our tax status?
Well, I guess, in my tradition, it goes back to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which I think was the ultimate first statement of separation of church and state. Paying taxes is, in some definitions, the measure of a civilized society. Being able to, my husband's late wife was from Norway, so John sometimes tells me that the wealthiest people in Norway he ever met were very competitive and liked to compete for who pays the most taxes. And they felt really proud if they were the one who paid more taxes than the super successful businessman across the table from them, between toasts of skål and akavit. I pay more taxes than you do, yeah. So we have to shift our values around that and figure also about money. Money is I'd like more money, of course I would. I'm talking to my daughter yesterday, she's saying, we were both talking about, geez, wouldn't it be nice if we'd married really rich men? But we know that we say these things. We don't mean it, honey, I swear to God. It's separating what life is about from money in a society which is saturated with greed. I put this aside for the talk, but I want to bring it back. A Buddhist friend of mine who teaches at University of Toronto, Peter Timmerman, once gave a talk on ecology and theology and faith. And he said, look, in Canada, we think we don't have a state religion. No state religion. We're a secular society. We don't look at God or look for God. He said, but we actually have a state religion, and it's econotheism. We worship the economy. And he said it has its own dogma, catechism, it has its own priesthood, it has all the elements of organized religion. But the problem is its primary value is selfish individualism, which, as he said, all great religions, regardless of their source or all faith traditions, all belief systems, will tell you selfish individualism, this is Peter Timmerman's words, leads straight to doom. So where are we? And we've had a very conscious effort, and don't think it's an accident that these laws are being passed that look just the same across multiple jurisdictions in Canada and globally. They're organized. The really bad people, the guys with guns, are really organized. And I got Lily, the babies, united. We're gonna have to do a lot more to step up outside of our comfort zones to say, we're gonna stand in solidarity. If you see there's a protest in your community to save a single tree, go chain yourself to it. If you see there's a protest in your community to stop them from buying up the last locally owned cannery, go chain yourself to the cannery fence so a transnational can't come in and take over local production. whatever you can, I'm sorry, I'm saying a lot about chaining yourself to things. That's way outside your comfort zone. But it's worth thinking about how can we do more to declare publicly that love of money is not why we were put on this earth, and love of money has never improved any society. We can say it, and people, I think, across political, geographical, cultural lines, I think there are very few people who would think that it was heretical to say it out loud. Greed should not be our primary driver, or we're going to be pretty unhappy. At least that's something people can say. Amen.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else? Oh, yes.
Hold on a minute, please. Could I
Oh,
just...
sorry. Oh, yeah. Oh, she's got a mic coming to you.
First of all, thanks for the wonderful inspiration and being able to synthesize it so clearly. It's just beautiful.
Thank you.
So from my heart, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I want to mention that if we just do what we can in our own individual lives. I heard a talk by my favorite Buddhist teacher, Gil Fronsdale, and he talked about an acupuncture point. And sometimes we can just act out of our altruism, out of our compassion, and we don't know the results. And I think it's important to let go of being that concerned about results and really focus on the process. And whatever we can do to look towards it. What's the possibility of cultivating more love and compassion?
Yeah.
And I also want to give a word for compassion for ourselves. So there's a tendency in Christian culture to put ourselves down. We're not good enough. So we have to have some sort of savior outside, unless you take it from a symbolic point of view. Okay. So I think also there is a need with the ego to bring compassion to ourselves, as well as self-care, as well as making some distinction between that and conceit. And I'm just saying that because I think there's a tendency in the West not to be able to do that very well.
Well, and what's your name?
April.
April, I should have also asked your name. What's your name?
David Bland.
David, and thank you for adding to my conversation with you. I'll just say this, April. I'm a real happy Christian, but I'm not a happy slappy Christian. I'm not I have a hard time with it because being a Christian in North American society, particularly if you're in politics, people assume right away that you're nuts. So in the United States, you can't get elected to anything if you don't say, Jesus Christ is my personal savior. But in Canada, that puts you in a bad place. And as a left-wing Christian who's a feminist who will defend women's rights to abortion and fight against greed and corruption and all that. So there is such a thing as a left-wing Christian. But I'm no better at taking care of myself than the nuts. So, and I love them. We all... Yeah, I've actually, the thing in Parliament that helps me stay alive the most is there's a Wednesday morning prayer group, and we don't share any opinions in common necessarily, but just caring about each other and gathering every 7 a.m. every Wednesday morning when Parliament is in session, just to be relatively quiet, which is interesting for politicians, and say, in this particular little goldfish bowl we're in, all the things that we don't think are Christ-led are the things that get us the most reward. So how do you struggle with that? And so that's where I get a lot of care and concern is people who are, and one of the rules about our prayer group is that we don't talk about it outside because we've shared secrets with each other and why we're praying for each other and what's going on in people's family life and stuff that we would never share. So I can't even tell you who's there except to say that, well, the entire Green Party caucus is there, but otherwise it's mostly conservatives, and we don't agree on much of anything. But they're my family in that place because we take the time to just be and not argue and not yell and just have that time to pray. It helps. So that's my little bit of self-care through the week. For the most part, for those of you who want to look it up, this is what keeps me going, it is Paul's letter to the Ephesians, Ephesians 3:20. Because obviously, if you, as I said earlier, if you don't believe in miracles, you're going to be depressed. Have to believe the miraculous can happen. The Haida Gwaii National Park that was mentioned earlier, I was part of the negotiations on that, and there was, it was literally, there was no way we were going to get Macmillan Bloedel to stop cutting down the trees that were 1,000 years old and 2,000 years old. The government of British Columbia was against us totally. Anyway, it happened, and I will always regard that, like the Montreal Protocol and other things, as actual miracles. But it could have just been, somebody else could explain it a different way. But Ephesians 3:20, that God's power working through us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Now that's a pretty powerful turn of words. I don't like Paul's politics very much, but he sure was a good writer. So I rely on that a lot, and prayer I rely on a lot. And trying to stop now and then, as I'm going to do right now, and just breathe in gratitude. Think through how grateful I am in this moment to be in a room with people from 27 countries around the world. People who came all the way from Nashville, Tennessee, to Vancouver, British Columbia, to be with people who are also seekers. So, you didn't know you were political activists when you came in here this morning. But bless you all, because you are now political activists. You're just going to operate on a plane where politicians may not notice you for a while till they realize that the culture all around them is now calling out for compassion, calling out for acts of love and caring and sharing, and the things that they say they believe, but they put aside a long time ago because they didn't seem practical. And the wisdom in our country, again, going back to ask an elder, the indigenous wisdom that's all around us in this country, that surrounds us literally in many of the places where we live. And that's true all around the world, obviously. The indigenous peoples of Amazonia suffered terribly under Bolsonaro. And here's Trump saying, I'm going to apply tariffs against Brazil, not because of any economic disadvantage, because the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil, but because Donald Trump is friends with all the fascists and bullies, and Bolsonaro is one of his buddies, and he doesn't like that the courts in Brazil are going to see how many laws Bolsonaro actually broke in trying to overturn the results of the democratic election in Brazil last time around. These are interesting things. Judge people by who they want to be, who's their friend. And I look at them and I think, wow, they're so alike, Trump, Bolsonaro, Netanyahu, Putin. Gee, they seem to have a lot in common. What do the rest of us have in common, and how do we build on that and out them for who they are?